An elderly woman stands on a dimly lit street corner selling candy to survive, ignored, invisible. But when Michael Jordan stops and hears 6 chilling words, everything changes. A past he doesn't remember, a truth buried beneath his success, and a system that chose him for reasons he never questioned. Was he the greatest of all time, or just the perfect illusion? Some legends are built, others are controlled. And now, the game he never knew he was playing is about to begin. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Michael Jordan sat in his private suite, high above the bustling city, where the skyline stretched endlessly in all directions. From his floor-to-ceiling windows he could see the world beneath him. The flashing lights, the restless movement, the energy of a city that never slowed down. He had conquered this world. 15 seasons in the NBA, 6 championships, 2 retirements, and an empire that extended beyond the game. His brand was everywhere. His name, immortal. Yet, in the silence of his penthouse where the world couldn't reach him, there was an emptiness he could never shake. Tonight was no different. He swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim lights of the room. His phone buzzed beside him. Deals, meetings, invitations, requests, another business venture, another boardroom filled with men who spoke in numbers and percentages, strategizing ways to expand his billion-dollar empire. Michael barely glanced at it. He knew the game too well. He could still hear the cheers of the crowd, but they were distant now, echoes of a life that felt unreal at times. On the court, he had a purpose, a mission. Every shot had weight, every game was war. Off the court, everything blurred into a series of obligations. Money had lost its meaning. He had more than he could ever spend, yet he spent his days chasing things that no longer thrilled him. Michael exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had built a legacy, but somewhere along the way he had lost something. What, exactly? He wasn't sure. He stood up, restless. Maybe he needed to get out. Not to another party, not to another meeting where people treated him like a walking brand. He just needed air, space, something real. Grabbing his coat, he walked out of the penthouse. No security, no assistance, just him and the city. The night air was crisp as he stepped onto the streets. He pulled his collar up, blending into the crowd. People walked past him, busy with their own lives. A few did double takes, recognizing him, but no one approached. He liked that. He walked without a destination, letting his feet carry him. He passed expensive boutiques, high-end restaurants, neon-lit bars, the usual spots. He kept walking. Something was pulling him somewhere else, though he couldn't explain what. Then he saw her. An old woman, hunched over a small cart selling candy on the sidewalk. Her clothes were worn, her hands frail. She moved slowly, adjusting the small plastic trays of colorful sweets. People passed by without a glance, their conversations and laughter drowning out her quiet presence. Michael stopped. There was something about her, something unsettling. He wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn. He watched as a man in a suit walked past, barely acknowledging her. A young couple did the same. The woman held out a piece of candy, her eyes tired but hopeful. No one noticed. Michael took a step closer. He had seen street vendors before, thousands of them in his lifetime. But this woman, there was something different. He wasn't sure if it was her eyes or the way she carried herself, but something tugged at the edges of his memory. She looked familiar, but that was impossible. Michael stood there, watching her for longer than he intended. He should have kept walking, ignored the feeling. Instead, he found himself reaching into his pocket, pulling out a $100 bill. He stepped forward and placed it on her small counter. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. And for a brief moment, Michael felt like the air round him shifted. She didn't react the way most people did. There was no gasp of recognition, no fumbling for words, no wide-eyed awe, Instead, she simply stared at him. Not at his money, not at his fame, at him. Something cold moved through his chest. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said softly. Michael felt his breath hitch. The way she said it, it wasn't a question. It was a statement. A chill ran down his spine. "Who are you?" he asked before he could stop himself. The woman smiled, but there was no joy in it. Only something knowing, something distant. "You'll remember," she murmured. "Soon enough." Michael's pulse picked up. A stranger's words shouldn't have rattled him. But somehow they did. She turned away, adjusting the candy on her cart as if the conversation had never happened. Michael stood there, rooted to the spot. He had faced some of the toughest competitors in history, stared down legends, played in the biggest games the world had ever seen. But this shook him in a way he couldn't explain. He took a step back, his mind racing. Who was she? Why did she say that? And why the hell did he feel like she was right? Michael Jordan had faced every kind of opponent, but tonight he had met a ghost from a past he didn't even remember. And something told him this was just the beginning. The wind swept through the city streets, carrying the chill of the approaching winter. The night was alive with movement, cars rushing past, neon signs flickering, voices blending into the chaotic symphony of urban life. But in the midst of it all, there was a small, almost invisible presence. An old woman stood near the corner of a dimly lit sidewalk, her hunched frame barely noticeable against the sea of hurried pedestrians. A small cart sat in front of her, stacked with candy wrapped in bright foil, their colors catching the glow of the streetlights. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the display, pulling her thin coat tighter around her frail body. No one stopped. People passed by without a glance, too caught up in their own lives to notice the elderly woman who stood there, night after night, hoping someone would care. The scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby food cart drifted in the air, mixing with the distant honking of cabs, but she remained still, her eyes scanning the crowd, waiting. Michael stood across the street, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching. He didn't know why he had stopped, why he had followed the invisible pull that led him to this particular corner, but now that he was here, he couldn't look away. There was something about her, something unsettling. At first glance, she was just another street vendor, struggling to make ends meet like so many others. But the more he watched, the more uneasy he felt. It wasn't just her frailty, or the way the world ignored her. It was something deeper, something in the way she carried herself, in the way her tired eyes seemed to be waiting for something. Then she looked up. For a moment, Michael thought she was looking directly at him. The connection was sharp, immediate. But before he could convince himself it was real, she turned away, resuming her slow, deliberate movements as she rearranged the candy on her cart. A man in an expensive suit walked by, glancing at her for only a second before continuing his conversation on the phone. A group of teenagers passed, laughing loudly, oblivious to the woman's presence. A couple strolled past, their arms wrapped around each other, their world too full of love and warmth to notice the cold shadow standing just feet away. Michael took a slow breath, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't the type to stop for things like this. He had spent years learning how to block out the noise, to move forward without getting distracted. He had seen struggle before, had grown up around it. He had learned early on that the world was ruthless, that kindness alone didn't get you anywhere. But tonight, something was different. He crossed the street. The sound of his footsteps was lost in the city's hum as he approached the cart. Up close, he could see just how frail she was. Her hands, wrapped in worn gloves, trembled as she adjusted the small jars of candy. Deep lines carved into her face told a story of years harder than most could imagine. She didn't look up as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the cart, clearing his throat slightly to get her attention. She didn't react the way most people did when they saw him. There was no surprise, no wide-eyed recognition. Instead, she glanced at the money for a long moment before finally lifting her gaze to meet his. And for the second time that night, Michael felt a jolt of something unexplainable. Her eyes weren't just old, they were knowing. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's stomach tightened. The way she said it wasn't a question. It was a quiet, certain fact. His throat felt dry. "Should I?" he asked, his voice steady despite the strange unease creeping up his spine. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that made him feel exposed. Then she simply smiled, a tired, almost sorrowful smile, as if she already knew the answer. "You will," she murmured. "Soon enough." Michael exhaled, forcing a small chuckle. "Is that so?" She didn't reply. Instead, she reached down and picked up a small piece of candy, carefully unwrapping it before holding it out to him. For some reason, his fingers hesitated before taking it. He felt something heavy settle in his chest, something that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Before he could say anything else, she turned away, her attention back on her cart, as if their conversation had never happened. Michael stood there for a moment, staring at her, waiting for what? Some kind of explanation? A sign? Nothing. The city continued around them, indifferent to whatever had just passed between them. Finally, he took a step back. Then another. The unease didn't leave him, but he forced himself to turn away, tucking the small piece of candy into his pocket as he walked back toward the shadows of the city. But even as he put distance between himself and the frail woman on the corner, one thing lingered in his mind. The feeling that he had just met a ghost who somehow knew something about him, something he didn't even remember. Michael Jordan had faced pressure before, the kind that could crush weaker men. Game 7, finals on the line. Thousands screaming, cameras flashing, history watching. He had stood in the storm, unshaken. He had made the shot. But here, on a cold city street, standing in front of a frail old woman selling candy, something inside him wavered. She was still looking at him. Not with awe, not with the starstruck wonder he was used to. No, her gaze was something else entirely. Knowing. Michael felt his chest tighten. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His mind raced. Was she someone from his past? A fan he had met years ago? Someone from Chicago, from Wilmington, from one of the thousands of places he had been in his life? But no. This was different. The way she said it wasn't a question. It was a quiet, certain fact. Michael forced a small chuckle, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Should I?" he asked. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, instead of answering, she simply smiled. Not the kind of smile that came from joy. Not even one of recognition. It was something deeper. Almost sad. Michael felt something cold move through his spine. He had spent his whole life reading people, on and off the court. He knew when a defender was bluffing, when a businessman was lying, when a reporter was pushing for a reaction. But he couldn't read her, and that bothered him. The sounds of the city blurred in the background, the hum of passing cars, the murmur of voices, the distant rhythm of music from a bar down the street. But in this moment, none of it felt real. Only her. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the strange tension. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but—" "You will," she interrupted, her voice still soft, but firm. "Soon enough." Michael frowned. "I'll what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached down and picked up a small piece of candy from her cart. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as she unwrapped it. Then she held it out to him, resting in the center of her palm. A strange silence stretched between them. Michael hesitated. It was just candy, a simple piece of wrapped sweetness. And yet, his fingers twitched slightly before he took it. The foil crinkled in his grip, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. Why did this feel like something more than it was? The woman watched him for another moment, then turned back to her cart, adjusting the rows of candy as if the conversation had never happened. Michael stood there, gripping the candy in his palm, his heartbeat oddly uneven. This was ridiculous. She was just some old woman selling candy. There was no reason for this interaction to shake him. No reason for the hairs on the back of his neck to be standing up. And yet, as he stepped away, he felt like he had just stepped out of bounds in a game where the rules had never been explained. His mind told him to let it go. His gut told him this wasn't over. And Michael Jordan had always trusted his gut. Michael Jordan wasn't the type to dwell on things. He had built his entire career on forward momentum. Miss a shot, take another. Lose a game, win the next one. No time to stop, no time to look back. But tonight, as he sat in his car parked across the street from the tiny corner where the old woman sold her candy, he couldn't shake the feeling clawing at his gut. She had said, "You will, soon enough." He had laughed it off at the time, a cryptic response from an old woman. What did it matter? He should have walked away, forgotten about it. But something in the way she had looked at him lingered. Michael had spent decades in the public eye. He was used to being watched. But that was different. People looked at him with admiration, jealousy, reverence. Some even with resentment. But she had looked at him like she knew something he didn't. And that was what he couldn't let go. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he watched her from the shadows of his tinted windows. She was packing up now, moving slowly, her frail hands carefully stacking the trays of candy into a worn-out cloth bag. The street had mostly emptied, the rush of the city retreating into a quiet hum of distant car engines and flickering streetlights. Then she started, walking. Michael hesitated for only a second before his hands moved instinctively. He started the car, keeping his headlights off as he followed her. She moved with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of carrying burdens too heavy to bear. Every step seemed slower than the last, as if the weight of time itself was pressing down on her. She turned a corner, then another. Michael followed at a careful distance. This wasn't normal. He knew that. He wasn't the kind of man who followed strangers through dark streets, especially not an old woman selling candy. But something deep inside him was screaming at him to keep going. She led him to a part of the city he hadn't seen in years, the kind of place that time had forgotten. Buildings with peeling paint, rusted fire escapes, sidewalks cracked with neglect. Finally, she stopped in front of a small, run-down apartment complex. Michael pulled over, watching as she struggled to unlock the heavy front door before finally disappearing inside. He exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. This is stupid. He should leave. He had no business being here. But the unease in his chest only grew stronger. Before he could stop himself, he got out of the car. The entrance smelled of dust and age, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten places. The walls were faded, water-stained, lined with mailboxes covered in peeling stickers from a lifetime ago. Michael hesitated at the bottom of the narrow staircase, listening. Silence. Then, a soft shuffle of feet from the floor above. He climbed the stairs, slow and deliberate, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. At the top, the hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by a single flickering light. He counted the doors. She had gone into 4B. Michael took a breath, lifted his hand, and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. Still nothing. But he knew she was in there. His eyes flickered to the doorknob. Old. Worn. The kind that might not have locked properly for years. He pressed his fingers against the door and gave it a slight push. It creaked open. The air inside was thick with a strange stillness. Michael stepped in cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The apartment was small, barely more than a single room with an old wooden table, a sagging couch, and a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. But what caught his attention wasn't the state of the place. It was the walls. His breath hitched. They were covered, plastered with newspaper clippings of him. Michael felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine as he stepped closer. The headlines spanned decades. His rise in the NBA, his championships, his retirement, his return. Photos of him in his Bulls jersey, arms raised in victory. Magazine covers. Articles. Some yellowed with age, others recent. And then a photograph. Faded. Old. He reached for it with steady hands, plucking it from where it had been pinned to the wall. His pulse pounded as he stared at it. It was a younger version of the old woman, standing next to a man he recognized instantly. His father. Michael's chest tightened. What the hell was this? His mind reeled, scrambling for an explanation. His father had died years ago, taken from him in the most senseless way. And now, here was this woman, hidden in a forgotten part of the city, living in an apartment filled with his life, with his father's face staring back at him from the past. The air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. A slow, deliberate sound came from behind him. He turned. The old woman stood in the doorway. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this moment all along. Michael opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. Then she looked at him, and for the first time that night she spoke with certainty. "I knew you'd come, Michael." The storm had arrived. The room felt smaller now, the weight of the past pressing against its walls. Michael Jordan stood in the center of it, surrounded by pieces of a life he didn't understand. His life, his father's life, and a stranger's story woven into both. The old woman moved past him, slow and deliberate, as if the moment needed no urgency. She knew what was coming. Michael didn't. She lowered herself into the worn-out chair by the small table, her frail hands resting in her lap. She didn't tell him to sit. She didn't need to. He did it anyway, pulling out the other chair and facing her like an opponent he wasn't sure how to guard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she took a deep breath, eyes scanning the wall of memories before settling back on him. "I used to know your father," she said finally, her voice even. "A long time ago." Michael's chest tightened. His father's name was sacred, locked in a part of him that not even time could touch. He had spent years trying to keep the memories intact, untainted by the way the world had taken him. "How?" Michael asked, his voice measured, guarded. The woman didn't flinch. "We worked together, fought for the same things. He believed in fairness, in opportunity, in making sure people like us weren't silenced." Michael frowned. "People like us?" She held his gaze. Black, poor, forgotten. The words cut through the space between them, sharp and unflinching. Michael leaned back slightly, arms crossing. "You're saying my father was involved in something?" "He was involved in the truth," she said simply. "And truth is dangerous when people in power don't want it spoken." Michael's jaw tightened. The woman exhaled slowly, as if summoning strength from a place long buried. "We were part of something bigger than ourselves. Your father and I, we were trying to change things. But we weren't the only ones who were watching. The wrong people started paying attention. And once that happened, we were marked." Michael's mind spun, grasping for something solid. His father had always been a proud, hard-working man. He had raised Michael with discipline, with love, with lessons that still shaped him. But this was something else. "What were you fighting for?" Michael asked. Her lips pressed together for a moment as if weighing how much to reveal. Then she nodded toward the clippings on the wall. "The system was never built for people like us," she said. "We knew that, but we refused to accept it. Your father had connections. Not powerful ones, not rich ones, but the right ones. People who wanted to shake things up, level the playing field. We had the proof of things that weren't supposed to be exposed, deals that kept certain people in power, that ensured men like your father would never rise above a certain level." Michael's fingers curled against the edge of the table. "My father never talked about this," he said, his voice low. She nodded. "Because he wanted to protect you. He knew the price of being involved. He paid it." Michael felt something heavy settle in his stomach. Are you saying my father was killed for this?" The woman's eyes softened, but the truth behind them was unforgiving. His death wasn't random. Michael's breath came slower now. The official story had always been a robbery gone wrong, a senseless act of violence, a moment that had shattered everything. And yet, deep down, hadn't there always been questions? The woman continued, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "After your father was gone, they came for me. They took everything. My job, my home, my name. I became a warning, a reminder of what happens when you don't stay in your place." Michael swallowed hard, his mind racing. This wasn't just about his father. This was about him. "You knew about me," he said quietly. "You followed my career." Her gaze didn't waver. "Of course, because they used you to erase everything he stood for." Michael's heart pounded. "What the hell are you talking about?" She gestured at the wall again, the newspaper clippings, the magazines, his legacy, laid out in headlines and photographs. "They turned you into the perfect story," she said, "a black man who rose above his circumstances, a legend, a billionaire, proof that the system worked. You became their symbol, the example they pointed to every time someone spoke out about injustice. If Michael Jordan can do it, why can't you?" Michael's hands clenched into fists. "You're saying they built me up so they could keep others down?" She nodded. "You were the distraction, the success story that made sure no one questioned why so many others never got the same chance." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Michael had spent his entire life pushing forward, proving himself over and over again. He had believed that hard work, talent, and determination were enough, that he had earned everything. Hadn't he? Or had he just been useful? His mind rebelled against it. He wasn't a pawn. No one had handed him his success. He had fought for it. He had sacrificed for it. But the doubt had already seeped in, threading through the cracks in his certainty. He looked at the woman again, at the years of struggle carved into her face. "If all of this is true," he said slowly, "why tell me now?" The woman's eyes darkened. "Because the people who did this," she said, "they're still out there, and they still decide who wins and who disappears." A chill ran down Michael's spine. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And whether you realize it or not, Michael, you're next." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Michael had spent his entire life outrunning ghosts. But tonight, they had finally caught up. Michael sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't seeing it. The sprawling buildings, the flashing lights, the streets that never slept, it had all been his kingdom, a world that had embraced him, celebrated him, built him into something larger than life. And now, that world felt like it was closing in. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. "You were the distraction. They used you to erase everything he stood for. And whether you realize it or not, Michael, you're next." He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. His entire career, his entire existence had been built on hard work, discipline, and an unbreakable will to win. No one had handed him anything. He had earned his place, hadn't he? His chest felt tight, because if what she said was true, if the same people who destroyed her had orchestrated his success, then what did that mean? Who was he? And worse, what would happen if he started asking the wrong questions? The whiskey burned as he took another sip, his mind racing. There were two paths in front of him, and neither led to victory. He could walk away, ignore everything the woman had told him, keep living the life he had built, the billionaire, the icon, the untouchable figure. Let the past stay buried. Let the ghosts whisper but never speak. Or he could dig deeper, find out who had been pulling the strings, expose the truth, and risk everything. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. What was the cost of truth? His reputation? His empire? His life? The next morning, Michael arrived at one of his office buildings, stepping out of his car with a controlled, effortless confidence that hid the war waging inside him. His assistant, Cameron, was already waiting for him in the lobby, sharp suit perfectly pressed, phone in hand. "Morning, boss," he said, falling in step beside Michael as they moved toward the private elevator. "You've got a meeting with the team at 10, lunch with the investors at—" "Cameron," Michael interrupted. "Do me a favor, look into someone for me." Cameron barely hesitated. "Who?" "An older woman, name unknown. She sells candy on the east side near Market Street. Lived in an apartment in a rundown building on the West End. Apartment 4B. Cameron frowned. "All right, what am I looking for?" "Everything," Michael said. Cameron nodded, already typing into his phone. "I'll get back to you soon." Michael stepped into the elevator, the doors closing in silence. 2 hours later, Cameron walked into Michael's office, his expression unreadable. "I found her," he said. Michael looked up, his stomach tightening. "And?" Cameron hesitated. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Michael didn't move. Cameron sighed, setting a folder down on the desk. "Her name is Eleanor Green. Used to be a civil rights journalist. Back in the 70s and 80s, she wrote a lot of exposés on racial injustice, corruption in corporate America, systematic oppression. Basically, she pissed off all the right people." Michael's jaw clenched. "And then?" Cameron exhaled. "Then she vanished." Michael narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, vanished?" "She lost her job, got blacklisted. Every article she ever wrote disappeared from the archives. She went from being a respected journalist to a ghost overnight." Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered. Cameron nodded. "No, it wasn't." He tapped the folder. "There's more. Before everything went south, she worked with your father." Michael's breath caught. "Your dad wasn't just some ordinary guy, Mike. He was involved in a movement, a quiet one, but powerful. People in his circle were trying to shake things up, trying to make sure black communities weren't just surviving, but thriving. And Eleanor? She was one of the people documenting it, exposing the people at the top who were making sure none of it ever saw the light of day." Michael swallowed hard. His mind flashed back to the woman's apartment, to the newspaper clippings, to the photograph of his father standing beside her. Cameron sat back watching him carefully. "She didn't just know your dad, Mike. She fought alongside him." Michael gritted his teeth. "And then she got erased," he murmured. Cameron's silence was confirmation enough. Michael exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Who was behind it?" Cameron hesitated. "That's the problem. There's no trail. Whoever did this covered their tracks too well." Michael tapped his fingers against the desk. His mind was moving fast now, pulling at the threads of a story he hadn't even known he was a part of. "And now she's back," he muttered. Cameron nodded. "Looks like it." Michael stared out the window, his reflection looking back at him in the glass. The world saw him as invincible, the greatest of all time, a man who had conquered everything. But now he felt like a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. "You think she's telling the truth?" Cameron asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, he said, "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Cameron nodded. "What's the move?" Michael's jaw tightened. For the first time in years, he didn't know. If he kept digging, there was no going back. But if he let this go, if he walked away now, then what kind of man was he? Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then Michael made his choice. "Set up a meeting," he said. Cameron arched a brow. "With who?" Michael looked at him, his expression unreadable. "With the people who built me." Cameron's face darkened. "You sure about that?" Michael didn't blink. "Yeah," he said, "I am." Because if there was one thing he had learned in his years on the court, it was this: you don't win by playing defense. And now, Michael Jordan was ready to go on the attack. Michael had always known power came at a cost. He had seen it firsthand, the way success changed people, the way money rewrote friendships, the way loyalty could turn paper thin when the stakes got too high. But this was different. This was personal. For the past 2 days he had been digging, pressing into the cracks of a story that had been buried for decades. And now, the world around him was shifting. Calls that used to come like clockwork, business meetings, investment pitches, endorsements, had started to slow. People who once fought for his time suddenly seemed distant. His closest allies were becoming strangers. Michael sat in his office, the skyline stretching behind him, phone in hand. He scrolled through his messages. A week ago, this inbox would have been full. Executives, athletes, billionaires, all trying to get a piece of him. Now? Silence. He dialed a number. 1 ring. 2. Then voicemail. He tried another. Same thing. His jaw tightened. Cameron walked in without knocking, his expression unreadable. "It's happening, isn't it?" Michael nodded. Cameron exhaled, setting a folder on the desk. "It started this morning. I checked your calendar. 3 meetings got pulled without explanation. 2 of your biggest sponsors suddenly need to reevaluate partnerships." Michael scoffed. "That fast?" Cameron gave him a look. "Mike, these people don't wait around. They don't play defense. The second they think you're a threat, they move." Michael leaned back, fingers pressed against his temple. "They're trying to scare me off." Cameron nodded. "And if that doesn't work, they'll try something worse." Michael didn't flinch. He had played too many games, faced too many opponents to be rattled this easily. But still, something about this felt different, bigger, darker. Before he could say anything, Cameron's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his face changed. "You need to see this." Michael took the phone. It was a message, anonymous, a single line. "You don't want to know the truth." His grip on the phone tightened. A slow, controlled breath. Then he set the phone down, exhaling through his nose. He should have expected this. He should have known the second he started pulling at the thread that something would pull back. Michael met Cameron's eyes. "Trace it." Cameron nodded, already moving. Michael turned back toward the window, watching the city he had once ruled without question. Now, for the first time, he wondered. Had he ever really been in control at all? That night, Michael sat alone in his penthouse, the weight of the last few days pressing into him. His father's face lingered in his mind. The memories of what he once stood for now tangled in a truth Michael hadn't been ready to face. If he walked away now, he could keep everything. The endorsements, the business empire, the effortless life built on decades of work. But at what cost? Everything he had ever stood for, discipline, courage, winning at all costs, was now staring back at him in the form of a choice. Win. Or fold. And Michael Jordan had never been the type to fold. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Cameron," he said, "set up a meeting." A pause. Then, "With who?" Michael's jaw clenched. "With the people who think they own me." Michael Jordan had played in the most brutal, high-stakes games in history. He had faced legends, defied odds, crushed opponents who thought they had him figured out. But this wasn't a game. This was war, and the worst kind. The kind without a scoreboard, without referees, without rules. It was a war fought in silence, in shadows, in the spaces between what people knew and what they were allowed to know. And now, he was in the middle of it. The first thing Michael noticed was the emptiness. Eleanor Green was gone. She had vanished without a trace. Michael stood outside her apartment building, staring at the rusted door that now hung slightly open. His gut twisted. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was erasure. Stepping inside, he moved through the dim hallway, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He reached apartment 4B and pushed the door open, and that's when he saw it. The place had been torn apart. The walls that had once been covered in newspaper clippings, gone, stripped bare. The table overturned, the couch slashed open. Drawers yanked out, their contents scattered across the floor. Michael took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Whoever had done this wasn't looking for money. This wasn't random. This was a message. Michael's eyes scanned the destruction, searching for anything that might have been left behind. Nothing. It was as if Eleanor had never existed. He clenched his jaw. This was his fault. She had warned him. The second he started asking questions, the second he started digging, the people who had erased her would come back to finish the job. And now they had. Michael moved further into the apartment, stepping carefully over broken glass. He reached the kitchen, scanning the small counter, the empty shelves. Then his eyes landed on something. A single object, left untouched. A candy wrapper sitting on the floor. Michael picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. At first glance, it was just a crumpled piece of foil. But then he saw it. Something written inside in tiny, almost invisible handwriting. A set of numbers. 23rd of September, 14 of March B. His pulse ticked up. 23rd. His number. 22 September? A date? 25th. A location. A time. 3B. His mind locked onto it. A room number. Someone had left him a clue. Or a trap. Either way, he had no choice. He had to follow it. The address led him to an old hotel on the south side of the city, the kind of place people checked into when they didn't want to be found. The neon sign flickered weakly, the parking lot half empty. Michael pulled his hat lower, keeping his face hidden as he stepped inside. The air smelled of stale smoke and dust, the kind of scent that lingered in forgotten places. He walked to the front desk. A tired-looking man barely glanced up from his magazine. "I need a key for 3B, Michael said. The man sighed, flipping through a worn-out logbook. Name. Michael hesitated. Then, without thinking, he said, James Green. The name came out before he could stop it. His father's name. The man barely looked at him before handing over a rusted key. 3rd floor, end of the hall. Michael took it and nodded. Then he turned and headed upstairs. The hallway was dim, the lights buzzing faintly overhead. Michael's steps were slow, controlled, his body tense in a way that reminded him of the final seconds of a tied game. He reached room 3B and inserted the key. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open. The room was small, barely more than a bed, a chair, and a desk. But his eyes locked onto one thing immediately. A single envelope, sitting in the center of the desk. Michael's breath came slow and steady as he stepped forward, his fingers grazing the edge of the paper. He picked it up, opened it. Inside was a note. 4 words. You're in too deep. And beneath it, one more thing. A photograph. Michael flipped it over and froze. The photo was old, slightly faded, but there was no mistaking it. It was him, younger, maybe 18 or 19, in a suit, standing next to a group of older men he didn't recognize. Or maybe, men he had never been allowed to recognize. His stomach twisted. What the hell was this? Who were these people? And why was someone making sure he saw this now? His grip on the paper tightened. Did I just make a mistake? Or worse, am I the next target? Michael had spent his life controlling the game, but now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was playing or being played. The faces in it were burned into his mind now. His younger self, barely 18, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit him, standing among a group of powerful men he didn't recognize. Or maybe, men he had never been allowed to recognize. He flipped the photo over again. The back was blank. No date, no names, just a silence that weighed heavier than any championship game he had ever played. His grip tightened. Something about this wasn't right. He had spent his entire life believing he had earned everything, that every point, every deal, every billion-dollar success was his because he had worked harder than anyone else. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if there had been someone behind the scenes, What if his success had come at the cost of something, or someone else? The thought made his stomach twist. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start looking. An hour later, Michael stood outside an unmarked building downtown, his cap pulled low. The offices inside belonged to Harrington and Company, a consulting firm that had managed deals for some of the biggest names in sports, business, and entertainment. Michael had worked with them for years: endorsement contracts, negotiations, branding. They had built empires for men like him. But now, as he stood at the entrance, he wasn't sure if they had been working for him or on him. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Mr. Jordan, we weren't expecting you." "I need to see Richard Harrington," Michael said, his voice even. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "One moment." Minutes later, Michael was led into a sleek, windowless conference room where Richard Harrington, a man who had advised him since his rookie days, was waiting. The older man smiled, but there was tension behind it. "Mike," he said smoothly, "this is a surprise." Michael didn't bother sitting. "What is this?" He tossed the photograph onto the table. Harrington's eyes flickered to it, and for a split second, so fast that most people wouldn't have caught it, his expression changed. A flash of recognition, of something else. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Harrington leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Where did you get this?" Michael's jaw tightened. "That's not the question you should be asking." Harrington exhaled, nodding slightly, as if conceding a silent game of chess. "Michael," he said, voice careful, "I think it's time you understood how things really work." Michael didn't move. Harrington leaned forward. "You think success happens in a straight line, that it's just talent and hard work, and for the most part, that's true." He tapped the table. "But it's also about who gets to rise." Michael's chest tightened. Harrington continued. "Back in the 80s, corporate America saw an opportunity. A rising black athlete with unmatched skill, charisma, and a clean image. You were perfect. The NBA was changing, brands were shifting, and you—" He smiled. "You were going to be bigger than basketball." Michael already knew this. None of this was new. But Harrington wasn't finished. "The only problem," he said, tilting his head, "your father wasn't the kind of man who played by the rules." Michael's stomach dropped. Harrington sighed. James Jordan was involved in things that made people uncomfortable. He wasn't just a proud father supporting his son. He was connected to people who were trying to shake the system. And that was a problem. Michael's hands curled into fists. "What are you saying?" Harrington met his eyes. "I'm saying, Michael, that the people who built your empire made sure your father couldn't interfere." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Michael's breath came slow, measured, but his mind was a storm. He had always believed his father's death was random, a tragedy, a senseless act of violence. But what if it wasn't? What if it had been calculated? What if the same people who had made him a global icon had first made sure there was nothing, and no one, who could stop it? Harrington watched him carefully. "Michael, listen to me. You are the greatest to ever do it. That's not a lie. That's not something anyone can take from you. But what you need to understand is that your success was useful." Michael's pulse pounded. "Useful to who?" he asked, voice dangerously low. Harrington sighed again. "The people who decide the narrative." Michael's stomach turned. The NBA, the brands, the media, the billion-dollar corporations that had turned him into a symbol. They had needed him, and they had made sure he would never question why. Michael's mind flashed back to Eleanor Green, to the woman who had fought to expose the truth, to the woman who had been erased, to the message left behind. You don't want to know the truth. But now he did. Now he couldn't unsee it. Michael's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Did you have my father killed?" Harrington didn't blink. "No." A beat of silence. "But the people I work for," Harrington said, voice carefully neutral, Knew that without him, you'd focus on one thing. Michael clenched his jaw. Basketball. His game had saved him, had protected him from asking the questions that might have destroyed everything, and they had counted on that. The walls of the conference room felt suffocating now. Michael had spent his life in boardrooms like this one, shaking hands with men in suits, signing deals that made history. But now, he realized, he had never been in control. Not really. Harrington sighed, leaning back in his chair. Michael, I like you. I always have. And that's why I'm going to give you some advice. Michael said nothing. Harrington's voice softened. Let it go. Michael's pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. I mean it, Harrington continued. You have everything, Michael. Power, influence, legacy, and more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. So why throw it away? Michael stared at him, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his father, about Eleanor Green, about every person who had been erased, silenced, cast aside so that a more convenient truth could take its place. Michael stood, his movements slow, deliberate. Harrington watched him carefully. Where are you going? Michael exhaled through his nose, shoving his hands into his pockets. To finish the game, he said. Harrington shook his head, almost disappointed. You think you're playing, Michael. Michael met his gaze. Aren't I? A pause, then a smirk from Harrington. You're already checkmate. Michael turned and walked out, because he wasn't so sure about that. Not yet. But there was one thing he did know. For the first time in his life, Michael Jordan wasn't playing to win. He was playing for the truth. The storm hit before Michael even spoke a word. He had expected pushback. But this was war. The first headline dropped at 7:42 a.m. Michael Jordan built his empire on a stolen story. Then came the second. The third. Within an hour, the internet was on fire. News anchors dissected his career. Panelists debated whether he had been a willing participant in something far darker. Social media was a battlefield, half the world defending him, the other half demanding his legacy be torn down. Fraud, conspiracy, cover-up. Everything he had built was under attack, and it wasn't by accident. This was a counterattack, a preemptive strike. The moment they knew he wouldn't back down, they made their move. They were coming for everything. Michael's phone buzzing relentlessly. Texts, calls, emails. Some were allies, others were wolves pretending to be friends. Everyone wanted a statement. His PR team was in meltdown mode. Mike, we need to get ahead of this, Cameron said, pacing the room. A denial. A controlled interview. Something. Michael didn't move. Cameron exhaled. Look, I know what you're thinking, but this isn't a game. This is your career, your legacy. They're trying to bury you before you can even tell your side. Michael finally looked up. His voice was steady. Then, let's tell it. Cameron hesitated. If you do this, if you go public with everything, you can't walk it back. Michael nodded. Good. By noon, the press conference was set. Michael had faced cameras his whole life, but today felt different. This wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about a brand deal. This was about truth. The room was packed. Reporters shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing. Millions watched from home. The stakes were beyond anything he had ever faced. And then Michael spoke. He told them about Eleanor Green, about his father, about the men in suits who had built an empire around him. Not to uplift him, but to use him. He didn't sugarcoat it. I was chosen. Not just because of my talent, but because I was the perfect distraction, he said, his voice unwavering. They erased people like Eleanor Green. They erased people like my father. And I didn't see it until now. A murmur rippled through the room. Michael leaned forward. But here's the thing. They think they own the game. They think they decide the winners and the losers. But I made a career proving people wrong. The cameras flashed wildly. If they think I'll back down now, Michael exhaled, shaking his head, then they never really knew me. The world was listening, and for the first time in his life, Michael Jordan wasn't playing to win. He was playing to burn it all down. Michael Jordan had spent his life chasing greatness. Championships, records, wealth, power, he had it all. But now, standing on the edge of a truth too big to ignore, he realized something. Greatness wasn't about what you took, it was about what you gave back. And as the world watched, waiting for his next move, he knew one thing. This wasn't about basketball anymore. It never had been. The fallout from the press conference was immediate. Networks ran endless coverage, debating whether Michael had destroyed his own legacy or cemented it. Supporters hailed him as the last honest man in power, someone willing to speak out when others stayed silent. Critics called him reckless, claiming he was unraveling the very empire he had built. Sponsors pulled deals. Investors backed away. None of it mattered. Michael wasn't playing their game anymore, but there was one thing he couldn't ignore: Eleanor Green. She was still missing, and Michael wasn't leaving this unfinished. 3 days later, a single call changed everything. It came from a blocked number, a voice distorted and low. "If you want to find her, come alone." Then, click. Michael stood in his dimly lit penthouse gripping the phone. A setup? Probably. A risk? Definitely. But he wasn't walking away. He had spent too long looking the other way, convincing himself that the past didn't matter, that as long as he kept winning, nothing else did. Now, for the first time, he wasn't afraid to lose. The address led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where people disappeared. Michael stepped inside, the air thick with dust and silence. His footsteps echoed, his senses sharp. He had faced defenders who tried to break him, men who had thrown their best at him and still failed. But this wasn't a game. A single chair sat in the middle of the space, and in it, Eleanor Green. Michael's chest tightened. She was alive, but barely. Her face was bruised, her hands shaking as she lifted her head to look at him. And despite everything, despite the fear, despite the pain, there was something unbroken in her eyes. She had fought too long to give up now. Michael rushed forward, but before he could reach her, a voice echoed from the shadows. "That's far enough." Michael stopped. A man stepped forward, dressed in a tailored suit, his face calm. "You should have listened, Mike," the man said. "You had everything, and you threw it away for this?" He gestured toward Eleanor like she was nothing. Michael's fists clenched. The man sighed. "It didn't have to end like this, but you kept pushing. So now, we clean up the mess." Michael's pulse was steady. "You think I'm the mess?" The man smirked. "No, Mike. You're the distraction." Michael's jaw tightened. That's when he heard it. The distant sound of sirens, growing louder, closer. The man's smirk faded. Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He turned the screen toward the man. A live stream. Millions of people watching. Every word, every move. Michael's voice was low, calm, deadly certain. "Not this time." The man took a step back. The sirens wailed outside. Doors burst open. And just like that, the game was over. 2 weeks later, Michael sat on a quiet basketball court, the sound of the net swishing as he took another shot. The ball bounced back to him. Muscle memory. He had spent his life here, on courts like this one. It had given him everything. But now he was ready to give back. Eleanor Green was safe. The people who had tried to bury the truth were gone, and Michael Jordan was about to make the biggest move of his life. He stood, walked to the sideline, and picked up his phone. Then, with one press of a button, he sent out a single message. A new foundation. $1 billion investment. Not in sneakers, not in teams, not in corporations, in people. Because being a legend wasn't about what you built for yourself. It was about what you built for others. And as the world watched, Michael Jordan built his real legacy. Some stories are bigger than the game. Some truths refuse to stay buried. Michael Jordan thought he had won every battle until he discovered the one fight that truly mattered. What would you do if everything you built was a lie? The game isn't over. It's just beginning. Stay sharp, stay watching. Because the next move, it changes everything.